In the grand scheme of the universe, which, contrary to popular belief, is not actually that grand when you've mapped 87% of it, there exists an organization so smugly self-important that they actually voted to name themselves the Consortium of Advanced Species. Yes, with capital letters and everything. The kind of name that practically begs to be spoken while looking down one's proboscis, tentacle, or whatever sensory appendage happens to be evolutionarily fashionable. The CAS, as they prefer to be acronymed, they made that a verb, not me, emerged from the ashes of 3 interstellar wars and 17 trade disputes approximately 4,200 standard cycles ago. Picture, if you will, a collection of species who had each independently reached the conclusion that they were the pinnacle of evolution, only to discover others with the same delusion. Rather than continuing to annihilate each other with increasingly creative weaponry, they decided to form a bureaucracy instead, arguably a slower but equally effective form of torture. The founding members included the Valaxians, think octopuses with superiority complexes and PhDs, the Meritocs, bipedal feathered mathematicians who communicate exclusively in equations and condescension, and the Drell, gaseous entities who literally look down on everyone from their floating containment spheres. Over time, 14 other species joined this exclusive club, each bringing their own unique brand of intellectual arrogance to the table. What united these disparate beings wasn't friendship, perish the thought, but rather a shared methodology for categorizing the universe. The KIAS classification system became their holy text, a 17-tier taxonomy that sorted all life forms based on technological advancement, cognitive capacity, and what they termed civilizational potential. The system was, of course, designed so that all KIAS members conveniently placed at the top tiers. It's not elitism, Dr. Nax Voon of the Valaxians once famously declared at a symposium, while literally floating above his audience in an anti-gravity chair. It's simply objective reality quantified through superior observation. The audience, composed entirely of fellow KIAS members, applauded with whatever appendages they possessed. Self-congratulation is, apparently, a universal constant. The KIAS approach to encountering new species followed a protocol so rigid it would make military dictatorships seem flexible by comparison. First, extensive observation from orbit. Second, limited sample collection. Third, comprehensive analysis. Fourth, classification. And finally, the appropriate action based on classification. Integration, for the worthy few, trade, for the useful many, or observation, for the developing masses, poor dears. This last category, observation, was a polite euphemism for what any reasonable being would call treating sentient species like lab rats in a cosmic science fair project. The CAS maintained over 300 observation outposts throughout the galaxy, monitoring thousands of pre-FTL civilizations with the detached interest of children watching ants in a farm. Occasionally, they would abduct specimens for closer study, always returning them with memories wiped and often with small improvements that the KIAS scientists found amusing. Remember when we gave those quadrupeds on Nexus 7th opposable thumbs? Reminisced senior researcher Ziltoth of the Meritocs during a particularly dull conference. Their entire tool-making paradigm shifted within 3 generations. We should do that again somewhere. His colleagues chittered in what passed for laughter among their kind. The KIAS justified these interventions as controlled evolutionary guidance, maintaining extensive records of their experiments in the Grand Archive, a data repository so vast it required its own moon. The fact that this moon also housed the KIAS's most exclusive resort facilities was, they assured everyone, purely coincidental. For millennia, This system continued without significant challenge. The occasional ethical objection was raised, typically by newly admitted species still clinging to outdated concepts like universal rights or dignity of sentience, but these voices were invariably silenced through the time-honored tradition of committee assignments and paperwork. Then came Sol System, specifically the third planet, a water-rich sphere that the CAS initially classified as moderately interesting due to its biodiversity, but developmentally unremarkable due to its dominant species. Humans. The first CAS survey ship to catalog Earth did so in what humans would call the year 1258 CE. The report, filed by junior observer Xalvix, contained what would later be recognized as a catastrophically understated observation. Dominant bipeds display unusual adaptive behaviors and tool usage. Recommend standard monitoring protocol with quarterly updates. Quarterly updates. For a species that went from horse-drawn carriages to nuclear fission in less than 7 centuries. By the time the CAS realized their miscalculation, humans had already developed radio technology, allowing the consortium to monitor their communications. What they heard both amused and perplexed them. Humans spent enormous energy discussing hypothetical extraterrestrial life, while being completely unaware they'd been catalogued centuries ago. They created entertainment about space exploration while barely reaching their own moon. They debated the ethics of artificial intelligence, while the KS had been using sentient computers for millennia. They're adorably delusional, noted Observation Director Plex 2 in the official update that raised Earth's monitoring status from quarterly to monthly in 2045 CE. They simultaneously overestimate their cosmic importance while underestimating their potential. A fascinating psychological paradox. What particularly intrigued the KS scientists was humanity's fractured nature. Unlike most species that achieved global communication and then rapidly unified, typically within 1 to 2 generations, humans seemed to become more divided the more connected they became. They organized by geography, ideology, resource control, and dozens of other factors that the CAS struggled to fully categorize. They compete when cooperation would be more efficient, observed behavioral analyst Vreen Cho. They fight over resources they're simultaneously destroying. They create artificial scarcity while portions of their population starve. By all established models, they should have either unified or annihilated themselves by now. Yet they did neither. They persisted, adapted, and continued advancing technologically at a rate that began to concern the more forward-thinking members of the consortium. The tipping point came in 2071 CE, when human quantum computing made an unexpected leap that the CAS's predictive models hadn't anticipated for at least another century. Suddenly, the species jumped 2 classification tiers in a single year, an unprecedented event in the consortium's meticulous records. "We need to understand this anomaly," declared High Administrator Zex Voon at an emergency session of the Observation Council. "Standard monitoring is insufficient. I am authorizing direct specimen collection and controlled study." And so, with the casual arrogance of beings who had been playing God for millennia, the KAS prepared to welcome humans to their laboratories. Not as colleagues, not as equals, but as particularly interesting lab rats. If only they had reviewed their own historical records more carefully. If only they had noticed the pattern across thousands of worlds. The species that advance most rapidly are invariably those that face the greatest threats to their survival. And in deciding to abduct humans for study, the Consortium of Advanced Species had just become humanity's newest existential threat. Dr. Xalvix belonged to the Valaxian species, which meant he possessed 12 manipulative appendages, skin that shifted colors with his emotional state, and an ego the size of a small gas giant. He was considered brilliant even by CAS standards, having pioneered several breakthroughs in xenobiology that earned him the coveted position of lead researcher at the consortium's premier biological research facility, the Nexus Institute. When the directive came to assemble a team for studying human specimens, Xalvix's skin flushed the deep purple of excitement, a reaction his colleagues politely pretended not to notice, as emotional displays were considered somewhat gauche among the upper echelons of caste society. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime," he announced to the empty laboratory, his voice modulator adjusted to its most dignified setting. "Perhaps several lifetimes." The selection process for his research team was rigorous to the point of absurdity. Xalvix rejected 47 qualified candidates before settling on his final roster. Dr. Trill Vex, a Meritoc specializing in cognitive mapping, Engineer Xalvix, a Drell expert in containment systems, behavioral analyst Nex Kur, one of the rare psionic Vrel capable of surface-level emotional reading, and junior researcher Plex Moore, a young Valaxian whose primary qualification appeared to be agreeing with everything Xalvix said. "Our approach must be methodical yet innovative," Xalvix declared during their first team meeting, his skin now a confident teal. "Humans have displayed unusual developmental patterns. We cannot rely entirely on established protocols." Trilvex fluttered her knowledge feathers in what her species considered a polite scoff. "With respect, Doctor, we've studied thousands of pre-FTL species. The variables may change, but the fundamental principles remain constant." "Perhaps," Xalvix conceded, though his skin darkened slightly at the challenge. "But consider their entertainment media. They've imagined scenarios of extraterrestrial contact for centuries, including concepts remarkably similar to our actual abduction procedures. They may react unpredictably." The team spent 3 cycles designing specialized protocols for human acquisition. Traditional methods involved selecting isolated specimens from low population areas, preferably during rest cycles when memory formation was minimal. However, human population density and their annoying habit of documenting everything complicated matters. Engineer Xalvix proposed a solution. "We'll use the new quantum displacement technology. It allows for extraction without the traditional light signature. To any observation equipment, it will appear as though the subject simply ceased to exist for 3.8 microseconds, well below the threshold of most human recording devices." The abduction parameters were set with typical KS precision. 3 specimens, diverse genetic backgrounds, varied geographical origins, all displaying above-average problem-solving capabilities, but not so exceptional as to be immediately missed. Age range, 25-40 standard Earth years. Physical condition, optimal. Social connections, minimal. "Remember," Xalvix cautioned as the acquisition ships prepared for deployment, "these are not just test subjects. They represent an evolutionary anomaly that could reshape our understanding of developmental patterns. Handle with appropriate care." The first target was Mira Okafor, a 32-year-old environmental engineer working at a remote research station in Tanzania. Her file noted several attributes that made her ideal: high intelligence, adaptable thinking patterns, and, most importantly for the KS, she had recently requested a 6-month sabbatical from her position, meaning her absence would not immediately trigger widespread concern. The extraction went flawlessly from a technical perspective. One moment Mira was walking alone along a dirt path toward her quarters after a late night of work. The next, she was materializing in a containment chamber aboard the research vessel Empirical Necessity. What didn't go according to plan was her reaction. Most species, upon sudden abduction, displayed predictable responses: terror, confusion, often physical collapse or catatonia. Mira Okafor took one look at her surroundings: the seamless white walls, the observation panels, the hovering medical scanners, and said, with remarkable composure, "Well, this is inconvenient timing. I was just about to make dinner." In the observation room, junior researcher Plex Moore's skin turned the pale yellow of confusion. "Is this humor as a stress response?" "Fascinating," murmured Xalvix, manipulating the controls to zoom in on Mira's vital signs. Heart rate elevated, but within functional parameters. Stress hormones present, but not at panic levels. She's adapting. Over the next 26 hours, Mira methodically explored her containment cell, tested its boundaries, examined the food delivery system, and even attempted communication with the invisible observers by developing a simple symbolic language drawn on the floor using the pigment from her food. "She's trying to establish a communication protocol," Nexcore observed, their containment sphere pulsing with interest. "Most species at this stage are still trying to escape or have resigned themselves to captivity." Xalvix's skin rippled with patterns of deep thought. Implement the first cognitive assessment. Let's see how she handles structured challenges. The tests began simply. Geometric puzzles, pattern recognition, basic problem-solving scenarios projected into her chamber. Mira approached each with methodical curiosity, solving them at a pace that, while not remarkable by Kaya standards, showed consistent improvement with each iteration. "She's learning the parameters of our testing methodology," Xalvix noted, her feathers bristling with reluctant admiration. "Look at the efficiency curve. She's optimizing her responses based on previous outcomes." By the third day, Mira had established a routine, even timing the intervals between tests and meal deliveries with surprising accuracy. She had also begun talking aloud, seemingly to herself, in what the KS researchers initially dismissed as a stress coping mechanism. "Day 3 of alien abduction," she would say calmly while performing her self-designed exercise routine. "Still no probing, thankfully. My captors seem more interested in watching me solve kindergarten puzzles than anything invasive. Small mercies." What the research team didn't immediately realize was that Mira was deliberately providing a narrative for them, establishing herself as a thinking being while simultaneously gathering data on what triggered responses from her environment. The acquisition of the second specimen occurred on day 5. Dominic Reeves, a 37-year-old structural engineer from New Zealand, materialized in a separate containment chamber. His initial reaction, a stream of creative profanity, followed by an attempt to physically damage the chamber walls, provided a stark contrast to Mira's measured approach. "More typical response parameters," noted SciFi, with something like relief. "Perhaps the female was an outlier." But within 48 hours, Dominic too had settled into a pattern of systematic exploration and testing. When presented with the same cognitive assessments, he approached them differently, more intuitive, less methodical, but with similarly improving results. The third acquisition brought Elara Chen, a 29-year-old quantum computing specialist from Singapore, whose response was perhaps the most unsettling of all. Upon materialization, she looked directly at the hidden observation panel and asked, "Is this about the breakthrough? Because I haven't published those findings yet." "Impossible," whispered Xalvix. "She cannot know she's being observed from that angle. The panels are molecularly identical to the wall material." Yet something in Elara's posture suggested she knew exactly where her observers were positioned. Within hours, she had mapped her chamber with precise pacing, identified all monitoring devices through subtle testing, and begun what appeared to be meditation, but was actually a memory exercise, mentally cataloging everything she observed. As the first week of the human acquisition project concluded, Dr. Xalvix found himself staring at the data with growing unease. All three specimens were displaying adaptation rates that exceeded projections by significant margins. They were learning, adjusting, and, most concerning, appearing to develop strategies rather than merely reacting. "We may need to revise our classification parameters," he admitted during the team's daily briefing. "These humans are demonstrating cognitive flexibility that borders on Tier 9 capacity." "That's only 2 tiers below our founding species," Plexmore pointed out, his skin paling to anxious white. "Indeed," Xalvix replied, his own coloration shifting to a troubled blue-gray. "And we've only just begun testing them." What none of the researchers verbalized, though all were thinking it, was the uncomfortable question. If humans could adapt this quickly to captivity and testing, what else might they be capable of? The answer would come sooner than any of them anticipated, and it would redefine the consortium's understanding of what constituted an advanced species. The problem with studying intelligent life forms, a fact conveniently glossed over in most KS research methodology manuals, is that they have an annoying tendency to study you back. By the beginning of the 3rd week, this reality was becoming increasingly apparent to Dr. Xalvix and his increasingly unsettled research team. Subject Okafor has completed the Level 4 cognitive mapping sequence, reported junior researcher Plex Moore, his skin flickering between professional blue and anxious yellow. "She finished in 47 minutes. "That's not possible," Dr. Trilvex responded, her knowledge feathers bristling in disbelief. "The previous record for any Tier 7 species was 4.3 hours, and this is only her 2nd attempt." Dr. Xalvix floated closer to the monitoring station, his 12 appendages moving in the complex pattern that indicated deep concentration. "Show me the solution pathway." The holographic display revealed Mira's approach, a completely unorthodox method that bypassed several expected steps in the problem-solving sequence. She hadn't followed the logical progression that the test was designed to measure. She'd essentially created a shortcut that the test designers hadn't anticipated. "She's pattern matching from previous tests," Xalvix realized, his skin darkening with concern. "She's not just solving the current problem. She's extrapolating the underlying structure of our testing methodology itself." Meanwhile, in Containment Chamber 2, Dominic Reeves was presenting an entirely different kind of challenge. Unlike Mira's methodical approach, Dominic had taken to what the research team could only describe as recreational defiance. He would deliberately solve problems incorrectly, then correct them at the last moment. He would create elaborate designs from his food before consuming it. Most disturbingly, he had begun performing what appeared to be theatrical monologues addressed to the corners of his chamber. "To probe or not to probe, that is the question," he declared dramatically on day 17, striking a pose that the cultural database identified as reminiscent of an Earth entertainment figure. "Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the tests and puzzles of outrageous aliens, or to take arms against a sea of experiments." "Is he malfunctioning?" Engineer Xalvix asked, their gaseous forms swirling with confusion inside their containment sphere. "No," behavioral analyst Nexcore replied slowly. "He's mocking us. He's adapted the work of a human cultural figure to comment on his situation. This suggests not just awareness of his circumstances, but the capacity to maintain humor about it. A complex psychological response." In the 3rd chamber, Elara Chen presented yet another variation of human adaptation. She had begun using the testing periods to implement what appeared to be physical conditioning routines, systematic exercises that seemed designed to test the limits of her own physical capabilities rather than respond to the challenges presented. Subject Chen has increased her cardiovascular efficiency by 7% since acquisition, noted Plex Moore. She appears to be deliberately optimizing her physical condition. But why? Wondered Xalvix. The tests are cognitive, not physical. The answer came 3 days later, when the research team implemented the first cross-subject interaction test. Following standard protocol, they created a shared virtual environment where the 3 humans could interact without physical contact, a controlled setting designed to observe social dynamics. The moment the virtual environment activated, connecting all 3 subjects, something remarkable happened. Instead of the expected period of cautious introduction and social hierarchy establishment that most species displayed, the humans immediately began exchanging information in what appeared to be a pre-planned, efficient manner. Tanzania Research Station, Environmental Engineering, Mira stated without preamble, taken while walking to my quarters. New Zealand, Structural Engineering, snatched from my workshop, Dominic replied just as directly. Singapore, Quantum Computing, disappeared from my apartment, Elara added. 23 days by my count. In the observation room, the research team watched in stunned silence as the humans bypassed all expected social protocols and moved directly to strategic information exchange. This isn't normal first contact behavior, Nexcour observed, their containment sphere pulsing with concern. They're debriefing each other like operatives. Impossible, SciFi countered. They've been in isolated containment. There's no way they could have coordinated this response. Yet, the evidence was playing out before them. Within minutes, the humans had established their respective expertise, compared their experiences in captivity, and begun theorizing about their abductors' capabilities and intentions. The tests are adaptive, Elara explained to the others. They adjust difficulty based on our performance, but there's a pattern to the adjustments. I believe they're mapping our cognitive processes rather than just measuring intelligence. The food delivery system has a 3.2-second vulnerability during the transition phase, Dominic added casually, as if discussing the weather. And I'm pretty sure I've identified 4 distinct observers based on which tests get adjusted, and how. Mira nodded. The atmosphere has been modified 3 times. They're testing our adaptability to different conditions. Classic experimental protocol. Establish baselines, then introduce variables. Dr. Xalvix terminated the virtual environment immediately, his skin cycling through alarmed patterns of deep purple and sickly green. How did they compile this level of observational data? The chambers are designed to reveal nothing about our methods or presence. It appears, Xalvix said slowly, that while we have been studying them, they have been studying us with comparable effectiveness, despite having no access to technology or prior knowledge of our existence. The implications were disturbing enough that Xalvix called an emergency research council meeting. Representatives from the CAS Observation Directorate attended virtually, their projected forms floating above the conference table with expressions of increasing concern as Xalvix presented the data. In summary, he concluded, his skin now a troubled gray-blue, these humans are demonstrating observational and adaptive capabilities that significantly exceed their species classification. They are not merely responding to our tests, they are reverse engineering our methodologies through observation alone. Perhaps we should consider terminating this particular study, suggested Council Member Vreen Tho, a senior Meritok whose elaborate feather patterns indicated centuries of experience. If they are this adaptive in captivity, their species may present unexpected challenges when they eventually achieve interstellar capabilities. Termination would be premature, countered Dr. Xalvix, surprising even himself with his defense of continuing the research. We have an unprecedented opportunity here. No species has ever demonstrated this particular combination of adaptability, observational acuity, and cooperative problem-solving without prior conditioning. The debate continued for hours, ultimately concluding with a compromise. The research would continue, but with enhanced security protocols and more aggressive testing parameters to better understand the limits of human adaptability. This decision would prove to be the first in a cascade of miscalculations. The day after the council meeting, the first incident occurred. During a routine atmospheric adjustment in Dominic's chamber, he appeared to suffer a severe respiratory reaction, collapsing near the food delivery portal. Medical protocols activated immediately, deploying an emergency medical drone into the chamber. The moment the drone entered, Dominic's collapse revealed itself as an elaborate performance. He sprang up with surprising speed, used his body to block the chamber's internal sensors, and managed to extract a small component from the drone before it could retreat. By the time the research team realized what had happened, the drone had returned to its bay, and Dominic was sitting calmly in the center of his chamber, seemingly empty-handed. "Full chamber scan," ordered Xalvix, his skin flushing dark with alarm. "Where is the component?" The scans revealed nothing. Somehow, in the 17 seconds of compromised surveillance, Dominic had managed to conceal the stolen item beyond the detection capabilities of Kaya's technology. "This is unprecedented," Xalvix declared, their gaseous forms swirling agitatedly. "No test subject has ever successfully extracted technology from a medical drone. The fail-safes are supposed to be absolute." "What component did he take?" Xalvix demanded. After a thorough diagnostic, the answer proved concerning. A neural interface connector, small, seemingly insignificant, but in the right circumstances, potentially useful for establishing connections with other technology. "Increase surveillance on Subject Reeves," Xalvix ordered, his professional demeanor barely concealing his agitation. "And implement isolation protocols. No more cross-subject virtual environments until we understand what they're planning." But the humans were already several steps ahead. During their brief virtual meeting, they had exchanged more than just observations. They had developed a rudimentary communication system using the only tools available to them, their daily routines. Mira began timing her exercise sessions to create patterns, simple binary code that, when observed from the overhead sensors, transmitted messages. Elara responded by arranging her food in geometric patterns that contained embedded information. Dominic used his theatrical monologues to convey coded information, embedding meaningful phrases within seemingly random cultural references. The KAS researchers, focused on their formal testing protocols and data analysis, completely missed this parallel communication system developing right before their eyes. By the end of the 4th week, the situation had evolved from a controlled scientific study to what one junior researcher nervously described as an arms race of observation, with the disturbing possibility that the humans might be winning. On day 31 of the Human Acquisition Project, Dr. Xalvix called an emergency team meeting. His skin displayed the mottled pattern that his colleagues had come to recognize as his deeply troubled but trying to appear in control coloration. "We need to discuss what I'm tentatively calling the adaptation phenomenon," he began, manipulating the holographic display to show 3 parallel data tracks, one for each human subject. These graphs represent cognitive adaptation rates across multiple testing domains. The blue line is the expected adaptation curve based on their species classification. The red line represents actual performance. The disparity was striking. In every category, the humans had not only exceeded expectations, but had done so by increasingly wider margins as the testing continued. "This isn't just rapid learning," Xalvix observed, Her knowledge feathers fully extended in the Meritok expression of scientific fascination. The curve suggests they're developing new cognitive frameworks in response to our testing, essentially evolving their problem-solving approaches in real time. Precisely, Xalvix confirmed. And more concerning is this pattern here. He highlighted a section where all three subjects' performance had spiked simultaneously, despite being in isolation. These improvements occurred after their virtual interaction. Somehow, they're building on each other's insights, despite having no subsequent contact. Engineer Xalvix's containment sphere darkened with concern. Could they have established some communication method we haven't detected? Impossible, junior researcher Plexmore insisted, though his skin betrayed uncertainty. The chambers are completely isolated. All sensory inputs and outputs are monitored. Behavioral analyst Nexcore pulsed thoughtfully. Unless they developed a system during their brief interaction that allows them to communicate through the very tests we're administering. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Review all test responses since the virtual interaction, Xalvix ordered. Look for patterns, anomalies, anything that could constitute a communication system. The analysis took 3 days, during which the testing continued. The results, when finally compiled, sent ripples of disquiet through the research team. The humans had indeed created a communication system, one so subtle and embedded within their legitimate test responses that it had gone completely unnoticed. They're using prime number sequences in their error patterns, Xalvix explained, displaying the evidence. When subject Okafor makes a deliberate error in a sequence test, the position of that error corresponds to a prime number. Subject Chen then responds in her next test by making errors at positions that, when combined with Okafor's pattern, create a rudimentary binary code. And subject Reeves? Xalvix asked, his skin now a deep, troubled indigo. His role appears to be confirmation and expansion. He uses duration, how long he takes to complete specific test elements, to acknowledge receipt of information, and add context. The revelation prompted an emergency call to the KS Observation Directorate. High Administrator Zex Voon himself joined the conference, his ancient Valaxian form barely visible beneath layers of life support technology. "You're telling me," he summarized after Xalvix's presentation, "that these primitive beings have not only adapted to our testing protocols, but have subverted them to create their own communication network, right under the observation of our most advanced monitoring systems." "That is correct, Administrator," Xalvix confirmed, his professional tone belying the stress patterns rippling across his skin. "Then the conclusion is obvious," Zex Voon declared. "The experiment must be terminated. These specimens have demonstrated capabilities that exceed safety parameters for continued study." A ripple of shock passed through the research team. Termination in KS protocol didn't mean releasing the subjects. It meant their elimination and comprehensive tissue analysis. "With respect, Administrator," Xalvix countered, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Termination would be a significant scientific loss. We are witnessing unprecedented adaptive capabilities. The research potential is precisely what concerns the Directorate," interrupted Zex Voon. "If 3 isolated specimens can develop these capabilities in captivity, what might their species accomplish if they become aware of the broader galactic community? The classification system exists for a reason, Dr. Xalvix." The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly heated, or as heated as discussions among beings who prided themselves on logical detachment could become. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The study would continue under enhanced protocols, with a termination order prepared but held in reserve. Meanwhile, Unaware of how close they had come to termination, the three humans continued their own investigations. Mira Okafor had progressed from simply solving the tests to analyzing the technology that delivered them. Through careful observation of how the holographic interfaces interacted with the chamber environment, she had begun to develop a rudimentary understanding of the principles behind CAS technology. During one particularly complex spatial reasoning test, she deliberately triggered a system error by providing a solution that the parameters hadn't anticipated. For 3.7 seconds, the holographic interface flickered, revealing fragments of the underlying code, which Mira memorized with remarkable accuracy. In his chamber, Dominic had been systematically testing the physical properties of his environment. The stolen neural interface component, carefully concealed inside a small tear he'd created in his mattress, had provided valuable insights into the material composition and energy systems of chaos technology. By carefully observing how the component reacted to different conditions, temperature, pressure, proximity to the chamber walls, he was mapping the invisible systems that powered his prison. Elara Chen, meanwhile, had turned her considerable intellect to the biological aspects of their captivity. During medical scans, she paid careful attention to the types of data being collected, the methodologies used, and the reactions of her unseen observers to different readings. She began to develop theories about their captors, their physical forms, sensory capabilities, and technological limitations. Through their hidden communication system, the three humans shared these insights, building a composite understanding far greater than any could have achieved individually. On day 42, during a routine cognitive flexibility test, Mira did something that sent alarms blaring throughout the research vessel. Instead of responding to the test parameters, she looked directly at the hidden observation panel and stated calmly, "We know you can understand us. We know you're studying our adaptive capabilities. And we know your technology has exploitable vulnerabilities." In the observation room, chaos erupted. How could she know the panel location? It's molecularly identical to the surrounding wall, Plexmore exclaimed, his skin blanching to alarmed white. More importantly, Xalvix interjected, how does she know we understand their language? We've never communicated directly. Dr. Xalvix, however, was focused on the most disturbing implication. She said, exploitable vulnerabilities. They're not just observing our technology, they're actively seeking ways to compromise it. The situation escalated further when, in their respective chambers, Dominic and Elara simultaneously delivered similar messages, clearly coordinated despite their physical separation. Your containment systems rely on quantum state monitoring, Elara stated matter-of-factly. Clever, but fundamentally flawed when dealing with observers who can influence the observation. We don't want conflict, Dominic added, his usually theatrical demeanor replaced by calm seriousness. But we will not remain specimens in your laboratory. The choice of how this proceeds is yours. The research team stared at the monitors in stunned silence. Finally, NextCore voiced what they were all thinking. They're negotiating. Specimens don't negotiate with researchers. No, Xalvix agreed, his skin shifting to a pattern never before seen by his colleagues, a complex swirl of colors that in Valaxian emotional language indicated a profound paradigm shift. They don't, but perhaps these humans have ceased to be mere specimens. He turned to face his team, all 12 appendages arranged in the formal position of a significant declaration. We need to reevaluate our fundamental assumptions. These aren't just test subjects adapting to captivity. They're intelligent beings systematically deconstructing our technology, our methods, and our intentions, using only observation and reason. What are you suggesting? Asked Xalvix nervously. "I'm suggesting," Xalvix replied, "that we may have miscategorized humans in our classification system, and that mistake might prove costly if we don't adjust our approach immediately." As if to punctuate his point, at that exact moment, the lights throughout the research section flickered briefly. A technical impossibility in a system with 17 layers of redundancy. "What was that?" Plexmore asked, his voice rising with alarm. Xalvix's answer was interrupted by an automated alert. "Security breach detected in primary research database. Unknown access pattern identified." Somehow, impossibly, the humans had made their first move. The KIS prided itself on many things, but perhaps none more than its impeccable record-keeping. Every observation, every experiment, every classification decision was documented with obsessive precision and stored in databases so secure that most species couldn't even conceptualize the encryption methods used, let alone breach them, which made the current situation all the more incomprehensible. "Explain to me," demanded High Administrator Zex Voon, his ancient form trembling with what might have been rage, or possibly a life support malfunction. "How primitive beings with no access to technology have compromised our research database?" The emergency response team had arrived within minutes of the security breach alert. Now, 12 hours later, the situation had escalated from a research anomaly to a full-blown KS security crisis. The holographic projection of Zex Voon loomed over the assembled team, his life support apparatus emitting occasional bursts of steam that somehow perfectly punctuated his displeasure. Dr. Xalvix, whose skin had settled into the muted gray of professional crisis management, attempted to explain the inexplicable. "Based on our preliminary analysis, the breach originated from within the testing systems themselves. Somehow, the subjects—" he paused, correcting himself. "The humans identified vulnerabilities in the cognitive assessment interfaces and used them to create a feedback loop that granted access to adjacent systems." "That should be impossible," interjected security specialist Vril Noor, a Drell whose gaseous form swirled with agitated patterns. "The testing interfaces are isolated from the main database by 17 security layers." "Evidently," Trilvex observed dryly, her knowledge feathers bristling, 17 layers were insufficient. The breach itself had been brief, lasting only 4.3 seconds before automatic countermeasures activated, but the implications were staggering. During that brief window, something or someone had accessed files relating to ship schematics, crew manifests, and, most alarmingly, the KS classification system itself. "We need to terminate this experiment immediately," declared Vril Noor. "These specimens have demonstrated capabilities far beyond their classification parameters. Protocol dictates immediate neutralization and comprehensive autopsy." "I disagree," Xalvix countered, surprising even himself with his vehemence. "Termination would be a significant scientific loss. We are witnessing unprecedented adaptive capabilities." "We've had this discussion already, Doctor," interrupted Zex Voon. "Your scientific curiosity is noted, but security protocols exist for a reason." "It's not merely scientific curiosity," Xalvix insisted, his skin flushing with patterns indicating deep conviction. "Consider the implications. If we terminate these subjects, we lose the opportunity to understand how they achieved this breach. The next time we encounter their species, they might exploit the same vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities we failed to identify because we eliminated our best chance to study them." A tense silence followed as the security team and researchers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Xalvix had made a compelling point, one that appealed to the KS's obsession with comprehensive understanding. "What do you propose instead?" Zex Voon finally asked, his tone suggesting he already regretted the question. "Controlled escalation," Xalvix replied promptly, clearly having anticipated the opening. We increase testing parameters to their maximum intensity. Push these humans to their cognitive and adaptive limits. Document everything, especially their methods of subverting our systems. Once we fully understand their capabilities and techniques, then we can implement appropriate countermeasures before proceeding with standard termination protocols. The debate that followed was heated by CES standards, which meant it involved slightly more emphatic gesticulation and the occasional color change or feather bristle. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The humans would be subjected to accelerated testing under maximum security protocols, with a final termination deadline set for 10 cycles hence. What no one in the room acknowledged was the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath their deliberations. For perhaps the first time in CES history, they were making decisions based not on scientific detachment, but on fear. When Dr. Xalvix returned to the research section, he found his team already implementing enhanced security measures. The testing chambers had been reinforced with additional quantum state barriers. The cognitive assessment interfaces had been reprogrammed with more aggressive parameters. Medical monitoring had been increased to track even the slightest physiological changes in the subjects. Separate testing schedules have been implemented as requested, reported junior researcher Plex Moore, his skin a professional blue, despite the stress evident in his posture. No two subjects will be undergoing the same test type simultaneously, to prevent coordinated responses. And their communication system? Xalvix inquired. We've introduced random variables into all test sequences to disrupt any patterns they might be using, Trilvex explained. They can no longer predict when or how tests will be administered. Xalvix nodded approval, though his inner appendages twisted with an emotion he couldn't quite identify, something uncomfortably close to guilt. Proceed with the new protocols. I want hourly reports on any anomalous responses. The humans, for their part, noticed the change immediately. In her chamber, Mira Okafor observed the new testing interface with a slight frown. So, that's how it's going to be, she murmured, just loudly enough for the audio sensors to catch. Escalation, rather than communication. Disappointing but predictable. In his chamber, Dominic Reeves responded to the increased monitoring with characteristic theatricality. The plot thickens, he declared to the ceiling. Act 2 begins with our alien friends deciding that if they can't understand something, they should poke it harder. A classic blunder throughout the universe, I'd wager. Elara Chen, always the most pragmatic of the three, simply sat cross-legged in the center of her chamber, eyes closed, apparently meditating. The medical monitors registered unusual brain activity, patterns that shifted too rapidly for the system to classify. For 3 days, the accelerated testing continued. The humans were subjected to increasingly complex cognitive challenges, physiological stressors, and psychological evaluations. Sleep deprivation protocols were implemented. Nutritional intake was modified to test adaptability under suboptimal conditions. Throughout it all, the humans demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their performance metrics declined slightly under the harsher conditions, but nowhere near the expected degradation curve. More concerning to the research team was a subtle shift in their response patterns, a new precision in their actions that suggested not desperation, but calculation. On the 4th day of enhanced testing, Dominic Reeves made his move. During a particularly demanding spatial reasoning test, he appeared to suffer a seizure, collapsing to the floor with convulsions so severe that the medical monitoring system triggered an automatic intervention. As the medical drone entered his chamber, Dominic's convulsions abruptly ceased. In one fluid motion that belied his supposedly weakened state, he lunged toward the drone, jammed the previously stolen neural interface component into a specific port, and then resumed his convincing performance of medical distress. The entire interaction took less than 2 seconds, so brief that the observation team didn't register the significance until the drone had already retreated from the chamber. "Replay that sequence," ordered Xalvix, his skin darkening with alarm. "Magnify Sector 4 of the visual feed." The enhanced replay confirmed their worst fears. Dominic had successfully interfaced his stolen component with the medical drone. But what purpose could such a brief connection serve? The answer came 90 minutes later when Elara Chen, in the middle of a cognitive mapping test, suddenly gained access to functions that should have been impossible. The holographic interface responded to her gestures in ways it wasn't programmed to, displaying information fragments that should have been inaccessible. "He created a back door in the medical system," realized engineer Xalvix, their gaseous forms swirling with agitation. When the drone returned to its bay, it connected to the central medical network, and the component he installed created an access point. "Isolate the medical systems immediately," ordered Xalvix. "Sever all connections to the testing chambers." But it was already too late. In the brief window before isolation protocols completed, Elara had managed to extract critical information about the ship's systems, specifically the quantum state barriers that kept the humans contained. "This is unprecedented," Xalvix declared, her knowledge feathers fully extended in the Meritok expression of scientific alarm. "No species at their classification level should be capable of understanding our medical technology, let alone repurposing it." "I don't think classification levels mean much anymore," Xalvix replied grimly. "Not with these humans." The situation deteriorated further when, 6 hours later, Mira Okafor initiated what appeared to be a direct communication attempt. Looking straight at the observation panel, which should have been indistinguishable from the surrounding wall, she spoke clearly and deliberately. "We know you've escalated testing because you're afraid. We know you're planning to terminate us once you've gathered sufficient data. And we know the quantum state barriers maintaining our isolation have a fundamental vulnerability at the resonance frequency level." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, then continued with chilling calmness. "You have a choice. Engage in direct communication with us as sentient beings, or we will be forced to demonstrate just how completely we've compromised your systems." In the observation room, stunned silence fell. Finally, behavioral analyst Nex Kaur spoke, their containment sphere pulsing with concern. "This isn't a bluff. The specificity of her knowledge about the barriers suggests they've gained significant understanding of our technology." "How?" demanded Plex Moore, his skin cycling through patterns of confusion and alarm. "Even with the medical system breach, they shouldn't have been able to access that level of technical data." "I think," Xalvix said slowly, his skin darkening to the deep blue of profound realization, "we've been asking the wrong question all along. We've been asking how they're accessing our systems, when we should have been asking how they're understanding them." He manipulated the holographic display, bringing up the humans' neural scans from their initial acquisition compared to current readings. "Look at these patterns. Their neural plasticity is off the charts. They're not just accessing information. They're processing and integrating it at rates we've never observed in any species." "Are you suggesting they can understand our technology just by observing its effects?" Xalvix asked incredulously. "Not just understand it," Xalvix corrected. "Reverse engineer it through observation and logical deduction. They see the results of our technology and work backward to comprehend its principles." The implications were staggering and terrifying. If humans could intuitively grasp advanced technology without prior exposure or education, what other capabilities might they possess? The question became moot when alarms suddenly blared throughout the research section. On all monitors, the same alert flashed. Quantum state barrier failure detected in containment chamber 3. Elara Chen had escaped. If there's one thing bureaucratic organizations excel at, it's developing elaborate protocols for every conceivable emergency, and then watching those protocols spectacularly fail when an actual emergency occurs. The KS was no exception. "Implement Containment Breach Protocol Zeta-9, shouted security specialist Vril Noor, their gaseous forms swirling with such agitation that their containment sphere struggled to maintain integrity. Zeta-9 requires authorization from 3 senior researchers, junior researcher Plex Moore pointed out, his skin blanched to panic white. "Then get the authorizations," Vril Noor snapped. "The authorization system is offline," engineer Xalvix reported, manipulating controls with increasing desperation. "All security protocols are cycling through random resets." Dr. Xalvix, watching the chaos unfold around him, experienced a sensation unfamiliar to most chaos researchers: grudging admiration for a test subject. "She's using our own systems against us," he observed, his voice calm despite his skin displaying complex patterns of professional concern. The medical drone breach gave her access to security subsystems. On the monitors, they watched as Elara Chen, supposedly contained in Chamber 3, appeared instead in a maintenance corridor 2 sections away from the research area. She moved with purpose, clearly following a mental map of the ship's layout. "How is she navigating?" demanded Xalvix. "Those schematics weren't in the files that were breached." "They didn't need to be," Xalvix realized. The ventilation patterns, the subtle vibrations in the chamber floors, the millisecond delays in response times between different systems. She's been mapping the ship's layout through micro-observations this entire time. Even as security teams scrambled to intercept Elara, new alarms blared. The quantum state barriers in Chambers 1 and 2 were fluctuating wildly, not failing outright, but becoming increasingly unstable. "They coordinated this," NextCore declared, their containment sphere pulsing with the Vrel equivalent of astonishment. "Subject Chen's escape is a diversion. The real objective is—" The analyst never finished the sentence. At that moment, every system in the research section simultaneously reset. Lights, environmental controls, security barriers, everything. For precisely 3.7 seconds, the ship's most advanced containment facility went completely dark. When emergency systems restored minimal functionality, the situation had fundamentally changed. Mira Okafor and Dominic Reeves were no longer in their chambers. More alarmingly, the observation room's sealed entrance had been overridden from the outside. The door slid open to reveal all 3 humans standing in the corridor. Elara in the center, flanked by Mira and Dominic. None appeared distressed. If anything, they looked remarkably composed for test subjects who had just executed an impossible escape. "Hello," Elara said simply. "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation." What followed was perhaps the most surreal security breach in KS history. Rather than attempting to flee or take hostages, the humans calmly entered the observation room and began examining the technology with open curiosity. "Fascinating interface design," Mira commented, studying the holographic controls. "Quantum entanglement as a base operating principle, but with biological integration components. Elegant." Dominic, meanwhile, was openly staring at the research team, the first time any of the humans had seen their captors directly. "Well, well," he remarked with a grin. "Tentacles, feathers, and floating gas bubbles. The universe really does have a sense of humor." The KIS researchers, trained to maintain scientific detachment in all circumstances, found themselves experiencing an unfamiliar emotion: embarrassment. Somehow, the roles had reversed. They had become the observed, the humans, the observers. "How did you compromise the barriers?" Engineer Xalvix finally asked, professional curiosity temporarily overriding alarm. "Resonance manipulation," Elara explained matter-of-factly. "Your quantum state barriers maintain coherence through synchronized field generators. Create the right interference pattern, and the synchronization fails momentarily. But the calculations required to identify the correct resonance pattern would take," Xalvix began. 17 days of careful observation and 3 humans with complementary skill sets, Mira finished for them. Dominic identified the physical components through his work with the medical drone. I analyzed the energy fluctuation patterns. Elara developed the mathematical model to predict the resonance vulnerabilities. Dr. Xalvix, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "You've made your point impressively clear. What do you want?" "First, control of communications," Elara stated. "We need to contact our planet." "Impossible," declared security specialist Vrilnor. "That violates every protocol." "Your protocols became irrelevant the moment we escaped containment," Dominic interrupted, his usual theatrical manner replaced by focused intensity. "We're not asking permission. We're offering you the courtesy of cooperation." To emphasize the point, Mira gestured toward the main control interface. Immediately, systems throughout the research section began shutting down in sequence. Life support excluded, but little else. "How are you doing that without touching the controls?" Plex Moore asked, his skin cycling through patterns of confusion and alarm. "The neural interface component Dominic modified," Elara explained. "Once integrated with your medical system, it gave us access to the ship's underlying command architecture. We've essentially become recognized users in your system." "That's," Xalvix began. "Impossible," Mira suggested with a slight smile. "You might want to expand your definition of that word." What followed was a tense negotiation, unlike any in KS history. The humans, despite having effectively seized control of the research section, showed no interest in revenge or escape, only communication and information exchange. "We understand your scientific curiosity," Mira explained as she manipulated the communication systems with surprising proficiency. "We share it, but experimentation without consent is not science. It's exploitation." "Your species wasn't classified as requiring consent protocols," Xalvix pointed out, her knowledge feathers bristling defensively. "Then your classification system is fundamentally flawed," Elara replied simply. While this exchange continued, Dominic had been systematically accessing the ship's database, absorbing information about the KS, the galactic community, and humanity's place, or lack thereof, within it. "So we're classified as a pre-integration observation subject," he noted, scrolling through files with increasing speed. "Alongside species that haven't mastered basic tool use. That's rather insulting." "Classifications are based on technological development, not potential," Dr. Xalvix explained, finding himself in the bizarre position of defending KS methodology to a test subject. "Your species hasn't achieved faster-than-light travel or unified planetary governance. Yet, we managed to compromise your most advanced research vessel in less than 2 months, with no prior knowledge of your technology," Mira pointed out. "Perhaps your metrics need revision." The situation reached its climax when Elara finally breached the communication firewall, gaining access to the ship's long-range transmitters. Rather than immediately sending a message to Earth, however, she turned to Dr. Xalvix with an unexpected proposal. "We want to negotiate," she stated. Not just for ourselves, but for our species. We've reviewed your protocols. We know the standard procedure would be to erase our memories and return us, with Earth remaining unaware of extraterrestrial contact until we achieve your arbitrary technological benchmarks. That is correct, Xalvix confirmed, his skin displaying the complex patterns of a being facing an unprecedented situation. We're offering an alternative, Mira continued. A controlled introduction, limited information exchange, preparation for eventual integration into the galactic community, but on terms that respect our autonomy and potential. The Consortium would never agree to such an exception, Vril-Nur declared. They might, Dominic countered, when they realize the alternative is explaining how 3 primitive humans managed to compromise one of their most advanced vessels and broadcast everything we've learned about the chaos to our entire planet. The implied threat hung in the air like a physical presence. The humans had positioned themselves at the ship's communication array, the most powerful transmission system within several light years. They could, theoretically, reveal the existence of extraterrestrial life to Earth in a way the KAS could not contain. "You're bluffing," Xalvix said, though her feathers betrayed uncertainty. "Such a revelation would cause chaos on your world." "Perhaps," Elara acknowledged, "but we've reviewed your observation files. Humans have been speculating about extraterrestrial life for centuries. The cultural shock would be significant, but not catastrophic." "More importantly," Mira added, "we've seen how you classify and treat species you consider primitive. We have a responsibility to ensure humanity enters the galactic community from a position of knowledge and strength, not as subjects to be studied and manipulated." Dr. Xalvix, watching this exchange, experienced a profound shift in perspective. These weren't test subjects anymore, if they ever truly had been. They were representatives of a species that had done what no other had managed, reversed the power dynamic with the CAS through sheer adaptive intelligence. "I will contact the High Administrator," he finally said, his skin settling into the formal patterns of diplomatic engagement. "I believe your demonstration has earned you the right to negotiate." As Xalvix moved toward the communication console, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. The CAS had abducted these humans to study their adaptive capabilities, and in doing so, had created the perfect conditions for those capabilities to evolve into something unprecedented. The experiment had indeed yielded valuable data, just not in the way anyone had anticipated. There's a certain poetic justice in watching the universe's self-proclaimed most advanced species squirm uncomfortably under the scrutiny of those they'd classified as barely worth noticing. If Dr. Xalvix had possessed the human capacity for ironic appreciation, he might have found the situation amusing. As it was, his skin displayed the complex mottled pattern that, in Valaxian emotional language, indicated profound existential recalibration, or what humans might simply call an identity crisis. The High Administrator's response to the situation had been predictably bureaucratic. Form an emergency response committee, implement containment protocols, and prepare 17 different contingency plans, none of which addressed the actual reality that 3 humans had effectively seized control of a KAS research vessel. "Your leadership seems remarkably committed to following procedures that have already failed," Mira observed as she reviewed the incoming communications on the holographic display. She had mastered the alien interface with disturbing speed, navigating complex systems as if she'd been using them for years rather than hours. "The Consortium has existed for millennia precisely because of our procedural consistency," Xalvix replied defensively, her knowledge feathers bristling. "Methodical response ensures optimal outcomes." Does it? Dominic asked, not looking up from the database he was systematically downloading, the complete KS records on Earth and human observation. Because, from where I'm standing, which is inside your supposedly impenetrable research facility, your procedures seem better at maintaining comfortable illusions than adapting to new realities. The humans had established a peculiar dynamic in the 12 hours since their escape. Rather than attempting to flee the ship, which, as they quickly determined, would be pointless given they were currently traversing subspace several thousand light-years from Earth, they had instead turned the research section into their own laboratory, with the KIS researchers as their reluctant research subjects. Elara had repurposed the cognitive assessment technology to analyze KS neural patterns, running what amounted to reverse psychological evaluations on her former captors. Mira had transformed the environmental systems into a test bed for understanding alien technology, methodically deconstructing and reconstructing various components. Dominic, meanwhile, had appointed himself cultural attaché, peppering the increasingly uncomfortable researchers with questions about their societies, biology, and personal histories. "So, you've really never had music?" he asked next core, circling the Vrel's containment sphere with fascination. "No rhythmic patterns for enjoyment? No harmonics for emotional expression?" "The concept exists in some member species," the behavioral analyst replied cautiously, "but the Vrel experience vibration as information, not entertainment." "Fascinating!" Dominic exclaimed, producing a small object he'd fashioned from components scavenged from his former cell. "Then, how would you interpret this?" He activated the device, which emitted a complex pattern of vibrations, a crude approximation of a Bach fugue translated into a medium the gaseous entity might perceive. The reaction was immediate and startling. NextCore's gaseous form swirled in patterns never before observed by the other researchers, and the containment sphere itself seemed to resonate with the vibrations. "That's disorienting," the Vrel managed after Dominic stopped the demonstration. "Yet strangely, I lack the conceptual framework to describe the experience." "I believe the word you're searching for is beautiful," Dominic suggested with a grin. Across the room, Dr. Xalvix watched this exchange with growing concern. The humans weren't behaving like escaped test subjects. They were behaving like researchers conducting their own study. More disturbingly, they were making discoveries about KS physiology and psychology that centuries of internal research had somehow missed. "You're worried we're gathering intelligence," Mira observed, approaching the Valaxian scientist. Her perceptiveness was unnerving. She seemed to read his emotional patterns, despite having no evolutionary framework for interpreting Valaxian skin coloration. "Wouldn't you be?" Xalvix countered, his professional demeanor barely masking his discomfort. "Of course," she acknowledged. "But consider this from our perspective. 3 weeks ago, we were going about our lives on Earth, completely unaware of extraterrestrial intelligence. Then we were abducted, imprisoned, and subjected to experiments without consent. Now we find ourselves on an alien vessel, surrounded by technology centuries beyond our own, dealing with species who view us as barely sentient curiosities." She paused, studying his reaction before continuing. "Under those circumstances, wouldn't you try to learn everything possible? Not just for yourself, but for your entire species?" The question struck Xalvix with unexpected force. For the first time, he found himself truly considering the situation from the human's perspective, not as a researcher analyzing subject psychology, but as one sentient being empathizing with another. "I would," he admitted, his skin shifting to the deep blue of genuine reflection. "And I would likely be less restrained than you have been." "We're not interested in revenge, Doctor," Mira assured him. "We're interested in understanding. The universe just got infinitely larger for us. We're trying to make sense of it, just as you were trying to make sense of us." This conversation was interrupted by Elara's announcement from the communication station. "The transmission is ready." The humans had spent hours preparing their message to Earth, a carefully crafted introduction to the reality of extraterrestrial life, designed to minimize panic while conveying essential information. They had debated extensively about who should receive it, eventually settling on a small group of scientific institutions and governmental bodies across multiple countries. "Are you certain this is wise?" asked Xalvix, her feathers displaying the Meritok pattern for extreme caution. "Your species has no unified governance structure. Multiple competing power centers receiving this information simultaneously could lead to conflict." "That's precisely why we're sending it to multiple recipients," Elara explained. "No single government or organization can control or suppress this information. Transparency is our best protection." "Protection from what?" junior researcher Plex Moore asked, his skin displaying genuine confusion. "From being classified as expendable," Dominic replied bluntly. "We've seen your records. Species that are deemed disruptive or unpredictably adaptive tend to find themselves subject to containment protocols rather than integration pathways." The CAS researchers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The humans had indeed been thorough in their review of Consortium records, including the darker chapters that most members preferred not to discuss. As Elara prepared to transmit the message, a final communication arrived from CAS Central Authority. High Administrator Zex Voon himself appeared on the main display, his ancient form barely visible beneath layers of life support technology. "This transmission is unauthorized," he declared without preamble. "Cease immediately or face severe consequences." Mira stepped forward, facing the projection with remarkable composure. "Administrator, with respect, you're not in a position to issue threats. We control this vessel's communications array. We have access to your complete records regarding Earth, and we've already prepared contingency transmissions that will automatically deploy if any attempt is made to interfere with us." "You're committing a serious violation of Consortium law," Zex Voon countered, though his tone had shifted subtly from commanding to negotiating. "Laws that were created without our knowledge or consent," Elara pointed out. "Laws that classified us as subjects rather than sentient equals." "What do you propose, instead?" the administrator asked after a calculated pause. "A new classification," Dominic replied. "One that recognizes humanity's unique adaptive capabilities and grants us observer status within the consortium while we develop the technologies to join as full members." "Unprecedented," Zex Voon declared. "So is this situation," Mira countered. "Your choice is simple. Adapt your protocols to accommodate us, or watch as we introduce ourselves to the galactic community on our own terms, beginning with this transmission to Earth." As the standoff continued, Dr. Xalvix found himself experiencing an emotion rare among CAS researchers: hope. Not for control or containment, but for something new, a genuine exchange between equals, despite their different evolutionary paths. The experiment had indeed produced valuable results, just not the ones anyone had anticipated. Bureaucracies, like certain primitive life forms, tend to respond to change by first denying it, then fighting it, and finally, when all else fails, by claiming they supported it all along. The Consortium of Advanced Species proved remarkably adept at this evolutionary pattern in the months following what official records would eventually term the human integration anomaly, and what unofficial records, particularly among junior researchers, called The time humans made everyone look like idiots. 6 months after the standoff aboard the research vessel Empirical Necessity, the Grand Council chamber of the Kias hosted an unprecedented event, the formal recognition ceremony for Earth's observer status. The vast amphitheater, designed to accommodate representatives from all 17 member species, now included a small but prominent section for the human delegation. Mira Okafor, Dominic Reeves, and Elara Chen sat in the front row, flanked by a carefully selected group of Earth scientists, diplomats, and military officials who still looked slightly shell-shocked by their rapid introduction to galactic society. Behind them, Dr. Xalvix observed the proceedings with the complex skin patterns that his colleagues had come to recognize as his human situation coloration, a unique blend of professional interest, grudging admiration, and lingering disbelief. The Consortium welcomes Earth as an observer nation, intoned High Administrator Zex Voon, his ancient form hovering above the central platform in a newly upgraded life support apparatus, one that, ironically, incorporated several design improvements suggested by Elara during the negotiations. This special classification recognizes humanity's unique developmental path and adaptive capabilities. What the administrator didn't mention, though everyone in the chamber knew, was that special classification was bureaucratic shorthand for we had to create an entirely new category because humans didn't fit anywhere in our existing system, and they refused to go away. The formal ceremony concluded with the presentation of the Observer Charter, a document that granted humanity limited access to CAS knowledge repositories, established protocols for cultural and scientific exchange, and, most importantly, explicitly prohibited any further unauthorized specimen collection from Earth. As the assembly dispersed for the obligatory post-ceremony reception, bureaucratic rituals being remarkably consistent across species, Mira found herself approached by a familiar figure. "Dr. Okafor," Xalvix greeted her, his skin displaying the formal patterns of professional respect. The ceremony was adequate. "High praise indeed, coming from you," she replied with a smile. "Though I noticed at least 17 protocol violations in the proceedings, the Meritok representative's knowledge feathers were displaying patterns completely inappropriate for a formal recognition." Xalvix's skin flickered with surprise. "You've learned to read Meritok emotional signaling?" "I've been studying," Mira said simply. "As have many humans since the knowledge exchange began. Your xenobiology databases are particularly fascinating." This was, perhaps, the most unsettling aspect of human integration into the galactic community. The speed with which they absorbed and applied new information. What had taken other species generations to assimilate, humans were processing in months. Already, Earth's scientific community was producing papers that built upon KS research in ways that made even senior consortium scientists uncomfortable. "I've been authorized to share something with you," Xalvix said, after ensuring no others were within hearing range. "The Directorate has completed its review of the Human Acquisition Project." "And?" Mira prompted when he hesitated. "And they've reached a conclusion that I find personally validating." His skin rippled with what might have been professional satisfaction. "The data suggests that humanity's adaptive capabilities were actually accelerated by the testing environment. The very act of studying you as specimens created conditions that maximized your problem-solving potential. You're saying that by trying to understand us, you inadvertently made us more dangerous?" Mira suggested, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "The Directorate prefers the term accelerated your developmental trajectory," Xalvix corrected, though his skin betrayed a hint of what might have been humor. "But essentially, yes." Across the chamber, Dominic had cornered a group of Drell representatives and was enthusiastically demonstrating what appeared to be a modified version of his vibrational music device. The gaseous entity's containment spheres pulsed with patterns that suggested either fascination or extreme discomfort, possibly both.